just sort of take views, opinions on some major themes and ideas that I have witnessed through this conference, and we could take one theme and then hand it over to the speakers and take 2 comments or 3 comments on that particular theme as sort of final closing comments on what they think. I think the first thing that we did in the unconference session was talk about networks, and specifically the spaces between networks. And we looked at how, by building a connected model, we still do go ahead and forget about the spaces between the networks. So would like a couple of comments summarizing that discussion from anyone.
What a bashful group. No, I don't know if we used to be the assumption, at least from the discussion that I interpret, is that networks really are an underpinning structure with a lot of what we deal with in education and educational use of technology, whether those networks are socially driven or whether those networks are technologically structured, like a lot of the discussions this afternoon around the use of new technologies and the different types of technologies that are being developed by local entrepreneurs. I think it really creates a landscape where learning to think and function in networks seems to almost be a critical mindset or a skill set that individuals have to have. But in terms of the final outcome of our networks discussion, I don't think there was really any conclusion to point to.
I think one of the interesting things that, for me, around all the different discussions we had around networks is just how accepted that conversation seems to be right now. You know, even a couple of years ago when the topic came up, it was something where it was a much more difficult conversation to explain to people. I know 3 or 4 years ago at my institution, we were talking about practicality and the stuff on the ground. I work very much on the ground at my institution. I work in the communications department. And that realization that now people are starting to connect amongst themselves, they're starting to understand kind of what Facebook is and how it connects amongst themselves. I've got students now on Twitter where 3 or 4 years ago it didn't happen. My mom followed me on Twitter today. And then she started making, and then she made fun of me 5 minutes later. But yeah, I get it honestly. And I think that what we're seeing now is an understanding of that point in line node sort of basis of a network that are making people, when you bring it up and you start talking about connectivity and how important it is, it's something that people now have a model of their own experience to understand. I think that makes a really big difference.
Yeah. I mean, I think if we're saying that one of the core skills or competencies that kids need in their future to be successful is collaboration, then you need networks of a variety of kinds. And sometimes it might just be 3 or 4 of us sitting around talking to try and solve a problem. Other times you might be sitting there in Brazil having a conversation and find out that somebody who's in Wales has a wonderful contribution via Twitter to actually push the conversation along.
Speaking for Wales, go Wales. I think one of the things I often think about networks is we can probably one of the key skills we could teach, probably not teach, but facilitate, whatever, give our students is how to establish, contribute to, and be a useful networker, because that's the kind of thing that you really take with you. And sorry to plug my own book, but at the start of my book, I talked about the process of writing this book compared to the process of writing the last book, which is about 2005. And the major change was the significance of the network in writing. It's like, that social network kind of did so much of the filtering for me, and kind of I could put calls out to it, and so how much of a kind of vital part of my professional practice it had come, and that's a kind of a 5-year shift.
And I think to bring it back again to the introduction, we're talking about those faculty and bringing people on board and engaging them. The idea of networking is not exactly something we made up. It's something we've been doing for generations and thousands of years. It's part of the way that we communicate with each other. It's the very basis of the academic research system, right? You've got one article, it has citations, they connect out to something else, and this network of knowledge starts to create itself. And I think in approaching faculty on the value of networks, starting from the point of view that they have 90, 95, 97% of the skills that they need to understand this, already latent there from their understanding of all these other networks that they're in. Maybe they don't use the word, but they already understand how to travel in that way. And then essentially, this step is just one more step along that road rather than something completely different, or rather, like, it's not an evolutionary change. And I think in terms of trying to encourage change, putting people in a position where they feel like they're coming from a position of strength, rather than coming at it as if the technology is new and therefore this brand new social event has happened. I think really it's organically coming out of the things that we already know. And I think that that's really a key to managing that change.
Yeah, but for a lot of people, networking brings new skills and it brings new ways of looking at things. In that, we just heard about collaboration, which is about working toward the same sort of objective, but in a network, it's often the case that you'll be working toward one objective, somebody else will be working toward another objective, and you find a point in common, a point of connection. That doesn't mean you have to be on the same side or doing the same thing. Similarly, a lot of people are used to working in closed environments. That doesn't work in a network environment. And the predispositions that people would have to keep things close to themselves rather than share. We were talking in the car earlier about not simply the value of sharing, but how sharing has actually transposed the security of one's own ideas, because now you can be sure of receiving credit for your idea by sharing it rather than by hoarding it, because when you share it, everybody knows that you did it. And there are other things as well. And so I don't think we should just say, oh, it's always been the same sort of thing. There are things that we've always done, absolutely. I talked about ChessNet. People have played chess forever. But there is a different way of looking at the world that networks bring to us.
Yeah, I think it's true that we have always been social animals, but the scale of the way in which we can interact in the net now is absolutely phenomenal. And as we were saying before the session, I think we need to rethink how we describe our interactions with these digital technologies. I don't think the kind of discourses we've used so far are adequate to describe what's going on anymore. So in the early days of the internet, it was very simple. It was about time. It was about place. So it was the notion of replicating existing practices. So the virtual classroom, the virtual university, the virtual cafe. But nowadays, if you think about each of our digital identities, somebody will be reading a tweet from Stephen, somebody else will be retweeting it, somebody will be looking at his blog, somebody else will be looking at something he's done on YouTube. So the kind of identity of Stephen is distributed in quite complex ways. Some of it will be synchronous, like sometimes when we've been tweeting, it's been almost instantaneous. Other times it might be that I read your tweet an hour later. So I think we need to rethink what the discourses are, and I think the work that Dave's been doing in terms of rhizomes is one very important area. But I think we need to think about the kind of new metaphors. One of the things I've been thinking about recently is I think with all these technologies, there are always pros and cons, and one of the negativities, I think, potentially of the way in which information can virally spread so quickly around the social network is that we're leading to a convergence of thought. So if you take the notion of memes as the notion of the spreading of ideas, in the digital context, the spread is massive. So I can tweet something and it'll go to 3,000 followers. Somebody else tweets it, it'll go to another 10,000. That scale. Sorry?
The Coney thing, for
Yeah.
instance, is a great example.
Absolutely. So I think we need to sort of think about, well, what does that mean? And is there a danger that we're converging on a smaller set of ideas? And do we need to kind of have some more disruptions of thought, if you like, rather than disruptions of technologies to take that forward?
I like that idea of thinking differently about our discourses. Because of prior bad, previous lives in which I committed crimes or sins or something, I think of the cognitive network in our brains and how what the evidence seems to be that what is our consciousness is emergent patterns across these networks. And I think that's part of what we're seeing in terms of the information memes that are spreading. But in our architecture, there's a bit of randomness, and I think there's quite a bit of sources of contrarian views. And just as a tweet can spread around, a contrarian view of it can likewise spread. And I don't know if we'll end up in stabilizing or finding certain stable parts of the network and other parts where there's continuing innovation. And then, of course, there will be disruption. But I think this is all a powerful thing in the long sense of the free exchange, the openness that's been a recurrent theme. George's conf bingo. I think openness has been a good potential winner in there. That allows the percolation of thoughts through the network, but allows the different viewpoints to emerge as well and be supported and allow a interesting dialogue, which I think will be an important part of networks.
I just want to follow up on something Stephen said. There's a very big difference between the theory level of this and the way that it actually hits the ground. And when I say that, talking to the faculty, they have 97, it's probably not really 97%. But at some point, trying to get the change to happen involves finding a narrative, finding a way of talking about it that people can grab onto. I mean, and that's what the trick is what tends to happen in our industry is one of two things. Either people who are committed to the ideas find ways to translate those ideas so that people who aren't super passionate about them can understand them, or I don't have a better word, charlatans, go about taking those ideas and finding ways to turn them in a different way that don't end up being as useful to the education process or as productive down the road. And I think at some point, and again, maybe too much time spent in the communications department, but I want the change to actually happen, right? I want to get in there and I want people to actually move. And I'm committed to the reasons behind that change, but there is a point at which you have to leave the language of networks maybe behind, or at least translate a little bit to get started so that you can get people one step down the road. And then maybe this comes later. I don't know. But to me, it's very important that we control the I don't obviously mean we, but that people who care about this process control the language translation from the theory to the actual, to use another overworn English expression, where the rubber hits the road, right? And that to me is maybe the most important part of this whole thing, is that it's great to have these conversations, and I really enjoy them, and I can lose days arguing the theory of this stuff. But at some point, somebody's in a classroom. At some point, somebody's designing a course. At some point, 1,500 people are buying education institutions. It's India, after all. It's not 5. But, and at some point, there are, several 100 million people who need to be trained. And at that point, you want to make sure that this stuff is ready so that it can be simplified to such a degree that it can be brought out over the whole. I mean, I obviously don't have the answers to that, but I think that's really important.
I'm going to come back to the management of change issue, which you brought up with us. I, just in thinking about things over the last few days, have a renewed sense of optimism about where things can go. And that thinking about the challenge of hundreds of millions of people leading different types of lives in the not too distant future, I mean, you have to think out of the box to even consider that sort of thing. And the talk of networks to me is that what has been sort of education behind the gates or in the ivory tower or whatever is finally starting to converge with real life. I mean, the whole world is being taken over by networks. This is a network era. The industrial age is dying rather rapidly. Value is created through connections. And we're finding out how the learning aspects of that take place. You've heard me again and again be sort of negative on let's build a lot of schools to train hundreds of millions of people, because I don't think it'll work. But I do think they're network solutions to bring people together where we're all learning together that are just awesome in the way that things could happen. So.
Yeah, but I hear what Dave says as well. The spaces between letters here on networks could really be INDIA or AFRICA, and that's something we need to figure out a way to not have that happen. The second theme is really around order versus chaos. Do we want order from chaos, or do we want chaos from order?
I'll jump in right off the bat here, because I love this concept, but there's an aspect to this concept that people don't get right off the bat. And that, and when you think about it, you think, oh yeah, you didn't need Stephen to say this, but the order that comes from chaos like that is not inherent in the chaos. It needs to be recognized. The order exists only in the perceiver. It doesn't actually exist. That looks like a picture of a woman only because we can recognize people that are women. If we had lived in a different culture where the men wore long hair and the woman wore short hair, we'd be saying that's a picture of a young man, right?
I always thought that was a picture of you, Stephen.
Nah, my lips don't look like that at all.
You stunned him into silence.
I've done it again.
So I think in education what we have right now is order. And I think we have teachers that are bludgeoned by a system that discourages risk-taking, and that you're not going to see any change at all unless you encourage a culture of risk-taking, which may not be chaos, but it's certainly bordering on chaos. I'll always remember the time about 20 years ago, I heard the president of Boeing Aircraft Corporation encourage all 100,000 employees to take risks, make failures, be willing to fail. Now, as somebody that flies a lot, I didn't necessarily want to hear that. But in essence, he was doing what any innovative corporation does. They take a lot of risks. They have failures. They learn from those failures, and they apply what they learn quickly. We're not doing that in education really anywhere in the world. So I think we do need to move from order at least towards chaos, at least to the point where we're doing a lot of risk-taking, making mistakes, and learning from it.
Well, Dave's grabbing the microphone, I'll jump in. I got my nerve first, so there. There's something that's implicit here that I want to make explicit, because I don't like just pure chaos. And in my mind, I see a distinction between sort of the powerful chaos of minds engaged in purpose and experimenting, like you're suggesting, Les, versus sort of the random chaos of entropy, which is a term that came up earlier in our conference. And it occurs to me what distinguishes to me is some sense of values, and we haven't really talked about that. There's been an implicit acceptance of moving things forward, of innovation and quality, and beginning to not only help people get jobs so they can survive, but then also imbuing them with some creativity and innovation that can lift the whole society and find new ways to create jobs and employment for people. And so I think there's a difference between a chaos imbued with a sense of purpose and value, which I think Boeing had. They didn't want random mistakes. They wanted sensible ones. And so it's something that's bugged me before. And Sternberg, for all that Robert Sternberg at Harvard, or for all that he sometimes has very simplistic three-part models, I like his model of wisdom. And I think that's a word that we sometimes have to think about, because too often we rush to be smart. And yet you can see the consequences of that in a movie like The Smartest Guys in the Room, where people get so carried away with being smart that they don't actually make decisions that are wise. And so I think we want to think about the values, and if we do think about the values, Sternberg's model of wisdom is making decisions that are both good in the short term and the long term, and not just for you and your close associates, but for those people you care about and the society as a whole. And it's explicitly judging in terms of the values and being explicit about the values. And I think you need to have that layer on top to make sense of, for chaos to be productive in a way that the order that comes out of it is something that is moving us forward and similarly driving us back into chaos in ways that will, again, move us forward.
There are two pieces in that, and sort of speaking back to that idea of creativity. One is the tyranny of assessment. I mean, to some degree, as long as the teacher is restricted by having to prove that assessments have been, then the students are restricted by that. And then, I mean, and that's not something I want to dwell on too much. The other part of that is encouragement. So how exactly do you encourage someone to be creative, right? I know how to encourage someone according to the order part of this system. I know how to encourage them to do what they're told, right? That we've got lots of structures inside of our school systems to do that. But encouraging someone to be creative, I can hear somebody responding to me and saying, well, people are naturally creative. If we're talking about a system, about developing a system, about reviewing it, about refreshing it to the point where we're going to have creativity and we're going to encourage it, for me, the big lagging question out there is how are we going to energize people towards that? What's the trigger point there? Because so much of what we do in our school system, so much of the way it's structured is about saying, you know, there was a young lady up here in the front of this morning who was saying, and then I got 18 out of 20 and I got in trouble, and there was a whole narrative around that, how that grade made her go back and study harder. And if you take that out and we say, no, what we want is creativity, we want you to be able to fail in ways that are creative, then that whole piece of encouragement and structure, we go back towards chaos. But how do we hold it enough that we can actually get something done? And we can encourage those people to keep moving, encourage them to come to school, encourage them to do great things. Because I don't think that's innate. I think there's got to be a structure there to support that. I don't know what it is, but I think there's a big piece there. If you take the order out, right, how do we make the whole thing come together? How do we get people moving again, you know?
Sorry, can I I think the other way of putting order and chaos is about control and quality. I did a workshop at the OU a couple of years back working with a faculty that doesn't use new technology much, and I was showing them blogs, so not particularly innovative, that you can give all your students these blogs. And one of the comments that someone said to me was, this means students can share links. That's a real worry, because at the OU we've always been really obsessed by quality, because quality meant a good reputation. And when we started out, everyone was kind of saying you can't do distance education, so we kind of, quality has been what we do. And I think for a lot of people, quality equals control. That's the kind of equation in the head. So if we control exactly everything the student does, we can kind of guarantee a certain quality. As soon as you let go of that control, then the concern is you kind of lower the quality. So, and we can argue about what that quality actually is, you know, and perhaps it's kind of days measurable stuff. But so to come back to Leslie's point, you know, no one ever got sacked for order. You might get sacked for chaos. And so there is that kind of context within which you're used to operating.
Yeah, I live in constant danger of being sacked for chaos. How do you get creativity? How do you encourage creativity? That's a fundamental question. I think it's really important. And the first pass at an answer is you value creativity. You know, the reason why it's hard for us to get creativity is that there's no value for it. As Martin said, people prefer order. And that's what we reward and that's what we pay for. Second pass at it is to model creativity, and this is very much the approach that I've taken over the years. To show that it's possible, first of all, to be creative. And you know, there's a lot of people who think they simply don't have the license to be creative, that they don't have the license to live their lives according to different values with a different purpose. Even in this discussion, there's been a lot of emphasis on sameness of values, sameness of purpose. The point is that there needs to be a value. But the point is that it doesn't need to be some specific value. You need to live your life for something. But what that is really is based on what you personally believe. And that's the sort of value that needs to be expressed and modeled in society. And I think if we have these two things, not simply valuing creativity, but also demonstrating and modeling creativity, that will take us at least part way down the road to actually achieving creativity.
Okay.
And once again.
Yeah. Maybe just one last comment on that.
Sure.
The line between this is very much what I was trying to talk about in my session today. So the rhizomatic network is partially chaotic and partially bounded by its ecology. So it has order and chaos implicit in it, right? And that's where I'm trying to get with that metaphor. It's one of the things it hopefully suggests. So I think there are others. I mean, that just happens to be the one that I like.
And a very important point, order and chaos aren't opposites. They're two aspects of the same thing. Everything is inherently ordered, inherently chaos. Everything has its own disorder. Everything is seen as something else.
So one of the conversations I had very early on in CCK08, and this was with Stephen. What if technology did not exist? And would connectivism still stand as a theory? And this is fairly specific. And Stephen's response was, it's like the principles of the steam engine. You know, it's something that is as true as that. And the other part of this was, what are the other conditions in general, you know, for connectivism to happen?
You're not going to take this, George? Well, okay. He's taken a vow of silence. The rest of us are shocked.
He wants the last word.
Yeah, he wants the last word. Connectivism exists because of technology, and the reason why it exists because of technology is technology made it a lot easier for us to see the major elements of technology, the major elements of connectivism. To me, connectivism is very much tied in with the theory of networks, and it's the use and application of networks in learning. It is the recognition that learning is a network phenomenon. This is true with or without technology. You know, a big part of connectivism is recognition that humans reason connectively. They don't reason cognitively. They don't reason in syllogisms or even in words. If you cut open a brain, you see a whole pile of neurons. You don't see a sentence. And we have this handy fiction that we reason in sentences, but it's not the case. So there would be a sense in which connectivism is true even without technology. Society is the same thing. A society is a series of connections. Graph theory, network theory, in which connectivism is in part based, existed long before the technology and was used to describe the structure, the makeup of society long before connectivism. There's the famous 6 degrees experiments where they used good old U.S. Post. It was kind of slow. We can do it a lot more quickly and more accurately now with technology, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily based in technology. To me, the main condition for technology is seeing the world in a certain way, seeing the world as a connected collection of individual discrete entities that communicate, that interact, but by being each diverse and individual, together create something more than could be created by any one of them. And that, to me, is the fundamental value of connectivism.
Well, I guess on my end, I would say that connectivism wouldn't need to exist if technology didn't exist. And the reason is that, technology solves or creates problems that only more technology can address and deal with. So I think from a connectivist perspective in particular, it's really the argument or the recognition that we're in this climate where humanity has advanced to a certain stage where we have sort of aggregated up and aggregated up and aggregated up. And so now we're dealing at a level of abstraction that just didn't exist. I mean, if you go back and you looked at a cave drawing, a tiger in the back of a car in a cave would be a tiger. So you would see this tiger and you would recognize that is a tiger. The tiger didn't stand for a tree. But today we've abstracted to a level where the modes of discourse and even the atomic units in today's ones and zeros, they're multifaceted in their capacity for interpretation and utilization. So what that means is that our abstraction now has been altered in such a way that it's increasingly not understandable unless it's a machine doing the interpretation. And so from that perspective, if you look at globally, the challenges that we face are really ones that have been raised by the technology that we've used. The knowledge problems that we have today are as a consequence of the technology growth. So, in the conditions primarily around connectivism, for me, is this emphasis of abundance. Abundance of information, abundance of technology.
I'm a connectivism student, but I'm glad, like today, because when I started thinking about this earlier on, it never occurred to me. To me, it's just going to be that distance between, like I read other theories, like when I was reading about, for example, culture or aspects of organizational learning. There are people that I read who are not even alive today. What I'm just trying to say is, when I started reading about connectivism, like the people I have always cited, I have read their works, who are here today, it never occurred to me like I would be sharing the same platforms with them. But what happened is, there are some things I'm sure in literature that I have read that probably they have not got the opportunity to see. Because the whole idea is, once an idea is shared, like Stephen said earlier, it goes beyond what you even intended sometimes. So there are a lot of things when I during my readings that I have got from other sources, like people contributing to the same idea. So first of all, I just want to say both technology and connectivism had always existed. There was never a point in time, in my opinion, when they never existed. What has happened is value has been added to them continuously. Technology was here before. It depends on how you define technology. Because to me, technology is what helps you do something better. There was a time it was even difficult for people to be able to create fire, right? Okay? The fact that you have got now tools that you can combine at that primitive stage to be able to get the fire out, straight away it's a form of technology. As little as it is, but it is. But as human beings, by nature, we grow. So as ideas grow, as knowledge grow, obviously the tools that we'll be using will also continue growing. So technology has been here long before. So is connectivism, because people used to relate in a way, because one idea about connectivism is to know, you need to know someone who knows what you want to know, so that you know what you want to know. So connection is about making connections, and that has been here ever. So to me, connectivism and technology has always been here and has been growing. The only thing is today, we are able to recognize this. That is why it's also valuable in this idea. Recognition is very important to be able to recognize. So it's being recognized now that to be able to have a better society, okay, where knowledge is not going to be held by individuals as their own property, okay? The idea is then let it be shared. And the fact also is that information is growing. So how do we contain it the way it is growing?
Great.
So this is where connectivism comes in, to be able to make sure that information is not only available, but it's also accessible. Because as you connect, like the tools that are in there, that's why in the research that I'm doing, this becomes very fundamental, because there are tools that are available today that can make this happen.
Okay.
But then I said...
Bakri, I want to move to the next theme.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll take it up.
All right.
Grania. You haven't seen the rest of the slide yet.
Oh, my favourite topic. Ooh.
Is design dead as we know it? Yes. Is it scalable? Yes. And while we were talking today, we got Dave Snowden on Twitter as well, who sort of jumped into the conversation when I said things like, can emergence be really designed? And Stephen and I talked about that, and he responded by saying that yes, you could have guidelines for creating complex systems, or complex learning environments, and those guidelines could look like boundary conditions, variable constraints, feedback loops, and so on and so forth. Thoughts?
Okay, well, this is my favourite topic, as you know. I truly believe that design is the key challenge facing teachers and education, and it's a very important part of the solution for getting that better uptake of the use of technologies and more effective uptake towards engaging learning outcomes for our learners. But it's not simple, as we know, and we've heard in lots of presentations, and Les was talking about the kind of research that's gone on over the ages. We're not getting beyond the early adopters or the innovators. There are key challenges for trying to shift faculty mindset away from a focus on content to activities. And that's certainly some of the things we've been doing in relation to that. But I don't think it's about design in isolation. I certainly don't think we focused enough on design, but I don't think it's just about design in isolation. I think it's design in connection, actually, with the other topics that have been discussed this afternoon. So it's about faculty being part of a connected network of peers and being able to work that connected network. So it's about having the conceptual tools at the design level to help them think and rethink their design practice, but within a kind of evolving ecology, if you like, of a kind of ongoing discourse with others in the network. So I think it's not dead, never will be, otherwise I'm out of a job. And yes, I do think it's scalable.
Well, I'm not ceding the design crown here, because that's what I do. Likewise, I mean, design is what makes my heart beat faster, getting creative and just finding mobile design and, you know, learning design. I really like design research as a framework that Tom Reeves talks about, where you don't work in a vacuum. You go out and you find a problem you want to solve, and you apply your frameworks and you iterate till you find out what happens. Then you go back and reflect on your frameworks. And I think that's part of the dynamism that I think you're referring to, Grania, that it's not live, but it's going to be, needs a community of practice. It needs practical problems to try and go out and solve, and then you use that reflection. And I think that's a vibrant, live, living design that we can take forward and use to accomplish the goals we're trying to set out.
If I could, I'd like to ask you, eminent experts, to address the issue of scalability more specifically. Because it's fine to say, oh, and it's scalable, I wish I could have that accent. It makes me sound so much more professional, but I can't. I can't do it properly. So I feel perfectly comfortable with you and you doing design, because you guys are passionate about it and you care about it, and it's all. And I'm sure that your design is really great. I've seen both of you guys do stuff. You guys are professionals. It's awesome. My concern is what happens once that leaves your hands, and how that happens once it leaves your hands into 10 people's hands. And 10 is okay, 20 is okay, 30 is okay, particularly if they've had contact to you. Yeah, I'm going to do it again. He's laughing at me because he knows where I'm going. But what happens once it starts to bureaucratize? I mean, we've seen this in the American education system again and again and again and again. And again, I'm Canadian, but the American education system has more scale for me to speak to. There's only 12 of us in Canada, and we all share an igloo, so we can't quite do it in the same way. If you look at the way that funding makes its way into the education system, you get funding for something that you can prove, and something that you can bureaucratize to the point that you can spread it out to 3 million teachers. How can you take design, good design, that's meant to be done by a professional and someone who loves their job, and send it out so that it works with a large group of people who love their job, a larger group of people who feel pretty okay about teaching, and another group of people of indeterminate size who, are okay about it. That's my concern about scalability with design.
Okay, I think there are two answers to that. The first is that the work that I've been doing over the last 10 years or so at the OU and now at Leicester has been very much about going beyond the individual expert, the learning design expert, into translating that expertise, if you like, into very simple conceptual tools, visual tools in particular, that others can pick up and use. And we've done a number of European projects now. We worked in particular with Cyprus and Greece, and the whole focus there was, instead of it being me or my mates, can it be ordinary practitioners in schools? Can we cascade that innovation? And we've learned very good examples of that. So we worked with teachers and teacher trainers in Cyprus and Greece, and we gave them the various conceptual design views that we've produced. We gave them access to CloudWorks as a social space to share and discuss, to be engaged in that reflection and peer dialogue. And we gave them the structure of a series of activities and workshops and events. We ran the initial ones, then the teacher trainers ran them, and then the students and the learners, the teachers picked them up. The second example, I think, relates to the work that the OU's doing, and I don't think we know exactly where it's going yet, Martin, but part of the work of the course business models work is to translate those designed tools and resources, institutionally embed them into the whole process. So we did a very detailed map of the curriculum process across the OU, and we found, the validation process. Anybody here being involved in validating a course, producing a course and getting it through the system? Okay. How many of you loved the paperwork? I mean, let's be honest, as teachers, we all hate it. We want to create the course, we want to get out there and engage with our students. We're just filling in the boxes to get through whatever committee hoops we need to get through. That's the reality. And what we found was that throughout the whole course validation process, there was nothing about design, there was nothing about pedagogy, it was all about business models. It was cart before horse, so teachers were having to make decisions about which tools they were going to use before they'd even designed the pedagogy for the course. It was nonsensical. So part of the aim of the course business models is build these kind of design views into the whole process, so it's embedded from the start of the kind of conceptualization of a new course through. And I don't know whether, Martin, you want to say anything in terms of where you think that's going or not.
Yeah, so it's interesting because we're getting to that point where it is becoming kind of institutionalized and so bureaucratized and stuff. And we've got another constraint coming along, which is like we need to be more efficient. So it's getting wrapped up with the whole kind of efficiency drive as well. So I think the way it will go is you'll have three kind of models. So you have a kind of develop an exemplar library of, we use the activity planner and the module map in particular to kind of represent a course. And you'll kind of use as is. It's like, I need to get a course out tomorrow, quick. Here's one that Arts did earlier, and I just need to change some of the content and use it as is. I think more common will be use as modification. Oh, look, I want to do an inquiry-based course. Well, they did a really good one over in the business school. I can take that and we'll modify it a bit. And the third one will be kind of, you've got carte blanche to innovate, but maybe within a certain cost constraint, so you still got to bring the course in for X. But we can have this really innovative tutor model as long as we cut down on the amount of content we produce, and we'll have these. So, and the fact is it will be part of the kind of stage gate approval process. You kind of got to go through those steps to say, but we don't know yet whether it will just become a tick, a box ticking exercise or something.
I guess the thing I would like, I'm thinking slightly differently approach to it instead of, what are people doing? It's like, what would be an environment where we have what you're talking about, Dave? And it's, I worry about the teacher who isn't really, at your second level derivative, you had these teachers, oh, well, they're not quite passionate and things. When I think about what would be lovely, would be where the teachers are passionate about helping their students, learners. They have the knowledge they need, and they're continually conducting experiments and sharing it in communities back and forth, that this worked, this didn't work, and they're, continuing cycle of innovation and improvement. So if that's there, how do we get there? You asked earlier about training creativity. How do we develop creativity? I'm mindful of my daughters in Odyssey the Mind, which is actually a very interesting program where they give kids some constraints around problems, and they sort of self-select which problems they work on teams. And other than meeting the requirements of the project, the entire reward is for their creativity. And it actually and the coaches for the teams are absolutely facilitated on how to facilitate creativity and how to not do anything else, not get in the way. You teach them, you show them how to use power tools, but the kids have to do everything. It goes on and on. And finding that passion, I'm reminded of the guy we heard Monday, and you got somebody to we heard them Sunday night, and you found somebody who could pronounce the name, and I'm not even going to try it either. But he talked about teaching as essentially a noble profession. And here in many places, people teach, and it's true in the U.S. and probably in Canada too, they end up teaching because they can't get the job they want or something, and they're not really passionate. And we need to find a way. I'm reminded of a doctoral thesis I heard about where they were studying how doctors in the U.S. before the 1920s, they were considered quacks. It was a suspect discipline. In the 1920s, they re-engineered their status in society. They made their training more rigorous. They made it elitist and selective. And now people end up thinking of doctors next to gods. I mean, you never question what your doctor says, wrongly. And the purpose of her thesis was to try and figure out how teachers might adopt this. And as a profession, we need to find a way to make teaching indeed a noble profession, one that's valued in society. And it's more here so than in the U.S., I think. But it's still not enough. But I guess the things I'm looking at is, and Sahana asked me, and I was thinking about, you need to take the top, passionate, knowledgeable teachers and teach them to be teacher trainers, but more, they need to be able to train teachers to be teacher trainers. So you start virally spreading it out. And I think that sort of investment in both giving them the knowledge and the passion and giving them the ability to share that and help them understand what it means to experiment in ways that they are safe to share. And that's a really big issue. Even if they made an experiment, could they tell others about it or would it be held against them is a big issue. So.
Can I talk for I'll try and be very brief, about my experience, which is, if you're in technology terms, you guys always talk about the delivery to the last mile. The people I work with are the last mile. They're the teachers. So they listen to all of these grand visions for wonderful design. And they find that there's no support to implement that grand vision for design in their classroom. And they may experiment. Probably, the research says if they're an innovator or they're an early adopter, in which case they already believe in what the design says. And if they're not an innovator or an early adopter, they just ignore it. And the last thing you hear when they listen to the visionary speech and they're going back into the classroom and they're closing the door is, and this too shall pass. So what do you want to do to get to, realistically, 3/4 of all teachers? Provide support. Several of you have talked about it. It needs to be timely. It needs to be just what they need. It needs to be just down the hall. It needs to be from somebody that they know and they trust. If that support network isn't there, you don't see risk-taking. The other piece that you really need to see is that they need to try this vision for a new design, and have some success with it in their classroom with their kids. And failing that, the vision and the design is dead. So that all of that says, no matter how wonderful our sense of vision is, if we don't supply support for teachers in the classroom, we're in trouble.
I think the major thing I would say about design is that while design is good and emergence, as it said there, can be designed, and I think as Dave Snowden got it right when he talks about boundary conditions, variable constraints, etc., the nature of the connection in particular. The danger is over-design. And the more designed you make something, the less likely it is to work for its intended purpose. And my own focus has been to try to find designs that are minimally prescriptive. So, and the way I like to express that is the design is the syntax. The design is the structure of the interaction. The design is the set of constraints. But the meaning, the purpose, and the values, those are brought about by the people who are using whatever the design is.
Thanks.
We've done that.
And
Les hasn't really spoken to that yet.
sure.
Probably won't either. Trying to keep my blood pressure.
But the thought here, and I was discussing with Stephen, was that probably there needs to be a new way to look at collaboration, and in particularly in terms of structured collaboration.
I would have given that perfect grade, a perfect grade.
That's the other
Would have been fire.
starting point. I thought it would be good to not just talk about policy, innovation, infrastructure, but also about people when you talk about change. And what do they need to change? This was an interesting one. When we heard that India and Africa could leapfrog, I have some problems with that. Probably we could discuss that. It seems as if there is a specific point that if we reach to, we will be better off. So maybe just semantics. This one is my favorite. We talked about democratization, but we have talked about it more in the sense of for the people. I think we should talk more about it in terms of by the people and of the people. That's another theme. And last is an idea that perhaps we need to look at the problem in a different way. Instead of saying top-down solutions, we look at ways in which we can leverage scale to meet the scale problems that we have. So meet scale with scale. Yeah. So meet scale with scale, democratization, leapfrogging, change, assessment, collaboration. Which one?
You pick, Martin. You got
Okay, I'll go on democratization. I think democratization of learning is what's interesting. So you can see that in many ways, and partly as a result of the economics of learning, the curriculum, for instance, has always been very tightly defined. It's what we, as talking about higher education, it's what we as universities think we can get a decent audience for. But as soon as stuff becomes open, then the curriculum, if you like, is completely democratized. So, for instance, there's really good knitting sites. There's really good communities where people share, not that I'm into knitting, but I've been told there's really good sites for people sharing knitting and stuff. And, we wouldn't have said, let's create a knitting course, but so whatever you want, there's enough people around who you can pull together. So if you're interested in, the history of Dundee Football Club or something, it might be a very small group, but you could probably find enough people that it's not a course, but it's some kind of learning community. So and I think that's really interesting, and where that meets formal education, because suddenly you've got this, to kind of use the overused term, this kind of big long tail of interest, which we couldn't meet before. We could only meet the kind of head of that tail, because that's where where the money was. But when you don't need to meet that money, then the curriculum, as it were, is kind of completely democratized.
I think it's interesting when we talk about democracy, who we're talking about it for. You know, sometimes I hear us talking about innovations for the teacher. Sometimes I hear us talking about innovations for the company. Sometimes I hear us talking about innovations even for the student. And it's not clear always who the beneficiaries of these innovations are. Everyone expected me to go longer.
I know. It's like, did he stop? It's interesting. It raises a question for me in terms of whether, and particularly in the Indian context, you need to come up with some values for what your vision for the future of education might be, and what will be the characteristics of that, and will things like democratization, for, by, of learning be part of those kind of value sets? I think that would be I think you're in such a unique position here that you have the chance to do that, to kind of really shape what's the future, the vision for learning in the future in India. That was very much what the Open Educational Resource Movement did, in my mind, with UNESCO in 2002 saying, okay, education is a fundamental right, educational resources should be freely available. And that was fundamental to the nature of that OER movement, which has shaped it all the way through. And if we broaden it out in terms of education, the future of education in India, what might the key terms be or values associated with that be?
Gentleman in the back.
With your permission, Biplav. Actually, this term democratization is something that we have used in a company I am on the board of to create a platform using the cloud technology called Quampus. And we believe that there are enough teachers. There's an innate, latent teacher in many of us, which doesn't get, the latent teacher doesn't get released because of various constraints. But if we leverage ICT really well, there can be a lot of teachers getting out to a lot of students around the world, and it need not be for free. Democratization doesn't mean it's for free, but it's for a low enough cost that you can pull in many more teachers willing to teach using the platform, many more students getting onto the platform, and this divide between haves and have-nots in terms of knowledge can be bridged using ICT. I haven't seen a whole lot of acceptance yet. I think we are a long way from accepting. We do it for search. What Google is to search, we would like to have such platforms be to e-learning. And I think I would like to hear from the audience or from the experts if there is any reservation about it.
Jay needs to speak because he brought this up.
Well, I'm not going to talk about products at this point, but I will talk about democratization a little bit. I mean, just the whole experience here, it seemed to me that there are a number of educationists who say there are a whole lot of people and they need to learn a lot of things, so school is the answer. You know, it's like the kid with a hammer sees every problem as a nail. And we're seeing school as a solution. And I'm not so sure, because schools at times can be very anti-democratic. They're control institutions. They're not promoting freedom. They're stamping the creativity out of people just in the name of conformity. So when I think of democratization, it's very much for the benefit of the learner that I'm looking at it. I don't know that I don't care that much about the role of the teacher in it when I think about this. And it's the pull versus push type thing. And I think of giving people the freedom and the knowledge to be able to stand on their own 2 feet and be their own people and be sort of learning, valuable citizens. And
Well, I want to play off that because it's saying something I believe very strongly as well. Well, and my problem with connectivism, as we talked about on Monday and in my blog post, was just that it expects self-capable learners, and I don't think they start with that ability. But to me, the democratization, in a sense, can mean devolve responsibility. And what I want to do is give learners the ability we start devolving to them the control of not just the curriculum, not the syllabus, but the curriculum, and have them start in taking ownership, and eventually they transfer to becoming self-developing learners. And that, to me, is the opportunity I want to start seeing syllabi and the rules within games and everything else up there for editing by the learners to take control and start understanding and experimenting that innovation we want the teachers to do, I'd like the learners to be able to do as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that when someone talks about connectivism needing self-capable learners, and the people that are coming into connectivist courses are people who've gone through high school and university, and they're not self-capable learners.
Agreed. We're not good at it yet.
Yeah. So I mean, it's hardly a criticism of connectivism, because it's a criticism. Like, you need something to make any system of learning work, right? The traditional schools need literacy and numeracy and showing up on time, and that's not always easiest to obtain. On the question of commercial resources, I will address that, because my own belief is that commercializing learning is antithetical to democracy. And it doesn't seem like that at first, but what's happened, it's one of these constraints you're building in at a structural level. What you've done when you commercialize learning resources is you've built in an incentive to make them scarce. Because the scarcer they are, the more the vendors of learning materials will benefit. And that's a fundamental reason to be concerned about it. You know, it seems like a really good idea, right? You take what you're already doing and just commercialize it, everything will be wonderful. But over time, if this commercial imperative kicks in, we see it over and over and over again in other domains.
So I want to shift the conversation about democracy slightly. We focused a lot on student-driven learning. And don't get me wrong, I love student-driven learning. But I think we're talking about something fundamentally different right now in this country, in the United States, which is quality education going to be affordable to all? And here we are to see a for-profit model that's not affordable to a significant percentage of the population. And in the United States, we're moving more and more in that direction. I have a college-age kid. I make a lot of money, and I can barely afford to send one to school. In 2 years, I'll have two. I'm not sure I can afford it. And I make more than 96% of the other Americans. The same thing is happening in K-12 schools. Quality is increasingly devolving to the private sector. So are we committed as democracies to providing high-quality, affordable education to everyone? Yes or no? I don't care how we get there. Are we going to make that commitment? And I think in the United States, the answer today is not really.
None of the Western countries can afford it.
And they're exporting that model.
The public sector's finished in a lot of these so-called Western democracies.
I think you might be right.
So how are we going to do it?
Well, as Jay said, we have to rethink the question of school. I mean, this is why I raised ChessNet, right? Or FootballNet or whatever. Like, everybody in India can play football, but almost none of them went to football school. You know, there are other ways. This is the whole point of students being able to teach themselves. You complain that you need self-motivated, capable students. Well, then create self-motivated, capable students. Do that when they're 5 years old. Give them some good role models. Give them the tools. Give them the space for creativity, and stop trying to constrain them. And that's when learning will take place. Yeah, I know, it's been said before. I'm not, just my standard caveat, nothing I say ever is original to me.
Well, thanks. Lovely discussion. I think, Jeremy, can we have a soundbite? A soundbite. What do you think about the conference? Where do you think this conversation is going?
There's one.
There's one of your words that I was really hoping the panel would comment on, and that was the one that said change. Because in India, I mean, there's all kinds of numbers being bandied around, but one that stuck in my head was the the comment from Kapil Sibal a couple of years ago now, when he said that India needed an additional 800 universities in the next 10 years. Now, many of the panel have commented the last couple of days about the mind-boggling nature of the numbers that are talked about here in India. And what's missing for me, I mean, I've thoroughly enjoyed, I mean, this is the best EDGE conference I've been to because of the quality of the speakers. But there's one thing missing for me is that very sophisticated theoretical debate, but what about practical advice for India about reform, transform, perform in getting from where we are now to 2020, where they need to provide higher education to so many more students.
And really give specific advice to somebody after being in a country for 3 days. But that's really what it comes down to. Change management on a scale like you're talking about. I already feel like I presume to make too much specific commentary. I mean, this is I lived 6 years in Asia. I have some idea of different contexts, but not this one. The challenges ahead are, I mean, I don't even think they're terrible. They're just completely different from the things in my experience. I've done change management. I've gone in and tried crazy projects. There's tons of experience around this room. And I think it was George who started this off by saying, why would you, like the specific advice is going to come from here and from the context. Yeah. So I wouldn't give specific, I mean, if I was here.
I don't think that was what I was getting at. If I meant that, I did mean it. But I just thought the conversations, if they were more contextualised in terms of the issues that we're facing in this country, I think would have been of benefit. But I reiterate the point I made earlier. I mean, there's been some fantastic contributions here, which I think all of us here are very glad to have you all come and share your wisdom. So thank you all very much for that.
No, I can see some. Sorry.
No, I just want to, I know you're heading up to wrap up VipLab, so I just want to, and I won't take the liberty of speaking on behalf of colleagues, but you will. No, actually I won't. So I won't speak on behalf of colleagues, but a few months ago, actually it was probably about 7-8 months ago, when VipLab sent an email mentioning the idea of this conference, and at that point it was before an approval stage. It was just a, would you be interested in thinking about this? And over a period of months, once the event itself got detailed and finalized and approval was given for running the EdgeX opportunity here, I just want to communicate to VipLab and to others who've been involved in bringing us out here. It's certainly been one of the more memorable conferences that I've been involved in, and I certainly leave, I'm 100% confident, with far more than I've left with anyone here. So it's been a very rich experience, but I do want to leave just a particular thank you to Madan and to VipLab for being outstanding hosts and a really enjoyable event.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So when we did this, the planning for the conference, we did various things. We did a website, we curated resources, we got as much information as we could put there. We put a Google Groups on there, and we had some collaboration pieces there as well. And we tried to sort of take inputs on every kind of things. And I hope we'll evolve over time. Hopefully we'll have many small EdgeXs happening or non-EdgeXs happening across India. I think there's already some interest from Bangalore to host a mini version of this in next 3 months. So I'm hoping that will happen. What I'm really interested in, curious about, is in the next 3 to 6 months, will people come forward and do their own massive open course on, say, educational futures for India? Will they do that? You know, that's kind of where I think if this conference has to make an impact, that's where it will make the most impact. Yeah. So I'd like to thank a whole lot of people, everybody that's been here, Hemant, Amrut, Manish, and everybody in this team that's been there. Of course, Madan, come on up, man. Give him a big round of applause, man.
And a massive round of applause I'm just trying to say something on the MOOC, and I tried to make one up, but Dave, you can help me. Massive open O claps. What did O stand for? Massive open outstanding claps, maybe. Okay, but I must say this has been such a crazy journey, but truly satisfying. When Viplav and I started talking about this a year ago, it was like saying, hey, what do we need to energize, the thinking of educational research? And we said there's Edge, why don't we do something called as EdgeX? Yesterday, Dave was asking, I think that was a very interesting conversation we had, saying, what are the things that you want to do, objectives that you wanted to achieve? Have you achieved it? And to my mind, I was thinking about it from last evening conversation, and then if we go back to our conversations, I said 2 objectives. One, how do we get a bunch of people from India who are working on a variety of education initiatives into the room, and let's understand, let's know what we don't know. And there's enough stuff that's happening around there that we didn't know existed. We now know it exists. I still don't know much about it, but I think I'm going back with the thing of saying, let me understand more of it. And I think we've achieved that with all the feedback that we got. The second thing is, how do we get this group engaged with India? How can we then have any of them attending any conference, and I want them to be able to say, you know what, I think this idea that I got will now work in India, and an email going out to one of us, or on the Google Groups post saying, hey, I attended this. This is something for India to consider. And I think that's a great connection to have made. And conversations with the feedback that we got from everybody, George's comments, I think that's hopefully another objective that we've achieved, or we will hound you guys till you achieve it. Right, so on that note, thank you very much. And my special thanks to Viplav. I wouldn't have known a single word of what we've discussed here 1 year ago. Daily conversations, oh, you don't know about connectivism? I said, what, is Cisco doing something again? Right? And that was my state a year ago, and it's been a fascinating beginning of a journey. And I do hope it's the same thing for all of you. And once again, kudos to all of us. Have fun.
Okay, so we just sort of, do we have tea or anything planned now?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bang! All right, thanks everybody, thank you.
Thank you.
So the best way a company can adopt